buttons. Okay, welcome back. In session 8, we talked a bit about Diffie-Hellman and RSA. We're going to get a second pass at specifically Diffie-Hellman in about 2 weeks. So if you were feeling a little uncomfortable with that, we're going to hit it from a sort of mathematically rigorous direction as we switch books over from cryptography engineering to a mathematical introduction to cryptography. But to do a quick review of last week's exercises, last week's problem was the sort of problem of understanding and getting a bit of intuition for modular math and modular math over primes, but also over composites. And since basically all of cryptography is over some finite field or finite field extension, where an extension of a field is basically if you just say take element A from finite field and element B from finite field and treat them as a tuple. That's a fairly good approximation for what a finite field extension is. Almost all cryptography takes place over finite fields, and we do that for several reasons. The main one is that it upper bounds the total size of our integer or of our field element so that we don't have to say make all field elements live in arbitrarily long arrays, which would be both inefficient and potentially vulnerable to length attacks. Other things are that finite fields have extremely useful properties. We can find inverses, do addition, multiplication, but there still exist problems within finite fields, like solving discrete log, that are difficult for classical computers. It's conjectured or well believed at this point that if a quantum computer of roughly 10 million qubits were to exist, then if it was able to keep those 10 million qubits in superposition for a period of hours or days, I forget exactly which, it would be able to solve the discrete log and factoring problems in polynomial time. But the extrapolation on sort of this is sort of maybe a tangent. The extrapolation here is that I think the current record in qubits is somewhere between 100 and 500 qubits in superposition, depending on how we count, or who counts. So the sort of distance from where we are now at a couple hundred qubits at most to a couple million qubits is still quite a far away. And if we were to just naturally extrapolate out on sort of the rate of advance there, we wouldn't expect a quantum computer to really exist before 2050 even. And that may be optimistic or maybe pessimistic. It's really hard to say. But in the meanwhile, we have discrete log, and we have factoring primes, or factoring composites into primes. So the exercises from last session were sort of meant to give some intuition for how factoring primes would work, or factoring large numbers would work, and how you can use the Chinese remainder theorem to sort of piece together a solution if you have some modular equation with a composite value. A composite value is any value that is not prime. If you have a composite value in the modulus. So if we take a look at the first example we were given, suppose that x mod 30 is 2. What is obtained about x mod 2, x mod 3, and x mod 5? And since 2, 3, and 5 all divide 30, excuse me, or more precisely, because 2, 3, and 5 are all, because 2, 3, and 5 all divide 30, we can simply reduce x mod 30 to x mod 2, 3, or 5, as we do on these bullet points here. I should probably change the indentation on that just a bit. But we can basically say 2 plus or minus 30k, which is the value of x mod 30. Instead of mod 30, we say that take that mod 2. We get that as, of course, 2 mod 2, because 30 times k is divisible by 2, which is then equivalent to 0. So we can basically do the same thing with the value mod 3 and the value mod 5, obtaining that we have these congruences going in the forward direction. And this is not the Chinese remainder theorem. This is just a simple application of modular math, that if we have this value that divides 30, that is not coprime with 30, then we can simply say, take this congruence and obtain the value. We can't do that with mod 7 because 7 does not divide 30. And so the example here was meant to deliver the premise that if x1 is 2 and x2 is 32, then x1 mod 7 would be just 2 and x2 mod 7 would be 4. So we can only do this with values that are divisors of 30 or not coprime with 30. So in the opposite direction here, the remainder of the exercises, we're sort of taking advantage of some machinery with Chinese remainder theorem. I mentioned Lagrange's theorem in this exercise. Lagrange's theorem is a fairly famous result that I think we're going to get to next week when we start covering the first chapter of A Mathematical Introduction to Cryptography. The question is, you're Eve intercepting a message from Alice to Bob. Alice asked Bob to choose a prime number larger than 30 to construct a prime field. So we'll cover this a bit in this week's section. Bob is tasked with choosing the prime that they're going to operate over, and Eve, intercepting the message on Bob's behalf, acting as a man in the middle, is going to choose a sneaky prime. And the sneaky prime she chooses is 31, with g equals 2. So as we did in the above example, we know that 30, that is p minus 1, is a prime with many small divisors. So we would expect there to be many small subgroups within the field of p, the field of integers modulo 31. And Eve has in fact selected g equals 2. So the subgroup that we're operating in is just g equals 2, g equals 2 squared, and so on up to g equals 5, where g equals 5 is 32, or sorry, g to the power of 5, which is 32. And 32 is just 1. So the subgroup that we're operating in with p equals 31 and g equals 2 is just 5 possible elements for Alice's secret value. So this means that Eve can almost certainly brute force what Alice's secret value is. She would be able to brute force it anyway if p was anything less than, I think the usual choice for Diffie-Hellman exponents is roughly 1024 bits. But this is sort of to demonstrate that if Eve chooses a sneaky prime, where the primes, the prime p minus 1 is divisible into many smaller primes, then Eve can choose a sneaky subgroup that is not particularly good for cryptography because she'll be able to brute force Alice's exponent. So yeah, this is sort of the thing that we want to check when we're using sort of a group, is that groups are particularly structured, and not every element within the group generates the entire group. So this is sort of meant to build intuition for how we choose generators and groups that we're operating over. So in the third question, this was meant to demonstrate that Bob could have chosen a safe prime instead, where p equals 83. And so the question for p equals 83 is, why is this a better choice for a prime, even if we're still talking about entirely toy values, where p equals 83, which is prime. How many unique choices for x does Alice have now? So the group g equals 2 and p equals 83. 2 generates, I believe, the entire group. So there are 82 choices for Alice's secret exponent. But if Bob instead chose g equals 3, then the number of choices halves. And this is actually about the worst we can possibly do in the group or the finite field with p equals 83, because 83 minus 1 only has 2 prime divisors, 41 and 2. And so this is what was meant by choosing a safe prime or a Sophie Germain prime, is that when p is of the form q times 2 plus 1, where q is also prime and 41 is also prime, then there is less that an adversary, or there is guaranteed to be only a few possible subgroups that the generator could possibly live on. So we have a lot less to check. Okay, so carrying on here, and you can check that fairly trivially. The exercises in this section, I give answers in Python because these are all fairly limited questions, and Python is a fairly easy language to just quickly say, check something is true. Yeah, and I think most people who work with cryptography or who are here are probably at least somewhat familiar with Python syntax. It's a fairly approachable language, and it seems like most people have encountered it at least a couple times. And the last question for this exercise set was that 576001 is the prime with a factorization of, again, many small primes. Find a generator with order G less than 10. And this is sort of meant to drive home that when we start using primes of slightly larger size, it's still possible, of course, to find these generators that enter small subgroups. And I think in total there are 21 choices for G, where the order of G is less than 10. So it should not be seen as particularly difficult to find a generator, a sneaky generator. The question, I think, really there is, how does Alice know whether she has been given a sneaky generator? And as before, if we want the generator to lie in a subgroup of at least, in the above example where the generator had at least order 82 and possibly order, or at least order 41 and possibly order 82, that was true because there were only 2 divisors of p minus 1. But in general, we're going to want our primes to have at least 2 to the 256 size cycles. And we want 2 to the 256 because of collision attacks, mean that an adversary can trivially perform a collision attack on the possible values for the secret key. So a 2 to the 256 cycle has 128-bit security if there are no other tools available to the adversary, and that was a bit hand-wavy. But it may have given some intuition about what we're sort of looking for when we're choosing generators, and why the choice of 576001 as a prime is particularly sneaky, because it divides into all of these small subgroups. We wouldn't want that. We'd want to use a safe prime to generate our group. And so with a simple script, we can obtain many different choices for a generator that would basically be unsafe to use. So yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. On the cycles, you said cycles. Did you mean like a cyclical group of order 2 to the 256? Is that what you meant by like number of cycles?
Yeah. So like even
Okay.
if we're operating over, let's say P equals Q, let's say NQ plus 1, where P and Q are in prime. Then we would want the order of the group generated. We would want the order of Q to be about 256, 2 to the 256, even if the order of P are large prime. And this is what we actually use for discrete log or Diffie-Hellman key exchange. We would expect the order of P to be roughly on the order of 1024 bits. And then we would operate over a subgroup of size Q for efficient computation. Was that clear, or should I expand on that?
That was clear from here. From here.
Okay. Cool. All right, I'm getting thumbs up. Let's carry on here. And I know that's a bit small, so if I use that again, I'll make it bigger. So that takes us to this week's topics. Before we move on, were there any other questions? All right, awesome. So I think this week's section was Well, just to start, I suppose I've said this last week, and I'll say it again this week. The cryptography engineering textbook, I think the rest of it basically goes on to discuss private key infrastructure. But I think it would be more useful to discuss some of the mathematical premises on which cryptography is actually based. If you're particularly interested in private key infrastructure, the remainder of the book may be interesting. But the sort of intuition for how cryptography is actually functioning at the sort of mathematical level for asymmetric key cryptography, I don't think is particularly well delivered by the textbook we've been following through. So we're going to be switching over to another textbook for the remainder of the course starting next week. And I think there is a link to that on this page and in the syllabus. So on chapter 13, most of chapter 13 is more or less just sort of, I think, I forget exactly what it was, but it was kind of extraneous to anything that I think is generally interesting or useful. Kind of goes through some, what is it even about? I think it does, it's talking about message encoding and parsing, which we talked about a bit before, protocol execution states and errors, which are sort of like a high level take at what programming is, but without an actual programming language, I found this to be largely useless. What was not largely useless is the class of replay attacks. And so there are a couple of fairly common ways that cryptographic protocols can fail, even if the underlying cryptography is entirely secure, and replay attacks are absolutely one of them. So the whole premise behind a replay attack is fairly simple. It's that Bob, let's say that Alice sends a message to Bob. We'll call this M0, but Eve says that I'm going to come in and intercept this, and the message is not going to get delivered. And say this was at time t0, and at time t1, it's maybe 15 minutes later, Eve decides, okay, now I'm going to deliver the message to Bob as if it was, as if it was sent by Alice at this particular time. And maybe some other messages happened between time 0 and time 1, where Bob is now asking an entirely different question. Maybe M0 represents the answer yes. And although Eve herself can't actually confirm that M0 is the answer yes, Eve suspects that it might mean something, and then she can block it and then reuse it at a later time. So how do we avoid Eve being able to arbitrarily rearrange messages, delay them, etc.? Well, we can't actually. We have to assume that the network can see all of the messages, deliver them out of order, exclude messages, and whatever else. And so the way we usually solve this problem is that we need some way for Alice and Bob to agree on timing. That when Alice sends message at time 0, that she is able to timestamp it in such a way that Bob will be able to recognize that timestamp in a consistent way with his own perspective, with his own frame of reference. So that sort of means that the network time protocol, the protocol by which we keep all computers across the internet in sync with one another and with respect to their clocks, the network time protocol is actually crucial to cryptography, in particular in cryptographic protocols, even if it has nothing to do with cryptography. Because it's how we prevent an adversary from rearranging messages, even if they can't necessarily tamper with messages. They can rearrange them arbitrarily. And of course, she can tamper with messages, but by secure encryption, of course, the best she could do would be entirely scramble them. Or the best Eve could do would be to entirely scramble the message. So this would be one form of protection against tampering is time stamping. So time stamping. And then the second thing is that if instead of blocking the message, Eve just observed the message, and she wanted to resend the message later at time 1, then that would be a replay attack. And so besides the fact that Bob needs to know that the message was timestamped at a particular time. Maybe time one now is, instead of 15 minutes later, it's 2 minutes later, and that's well within a timeout sort of setting. Bob needs some way to say, I've seen this before. So if Bob has seen a message before, then even if it's not outside of its timeout sort of range, then he needs to say, wait, that's not a new message. I still recognize that message, and it's something that I saw 2 minutes ago. And so if Bob's timeout is 15 minutes, after 15 minutes, he can discard his cache of old messages. But before 15 minutes, then Bob needs to say, well, I have all the messages from the last 15 minutes, and Alice could not possibly replay a message as if it was a new message, or Eve could not replay a message if it was a new message. And so these two kinds of attacks, first delivering a message outside of its sort of time to live, and second, trying to replay a message within its time to live that is not a new message, are two things that an attacker can do on a network that are particularly salient. And if not handled correctly, of course, Eve can do some nasty stuff. And that's basically all there is to understanding replays and retries. It's that the network cannot be assumed to be honest. The network can shuffle messages. The network can intentionally delay messages. And using a timestamp and being able to differentiate message 0 from another version of message 0 is important. And Bob doesn't necessarily need to store the entire message 0. He could instead store a nonce correlated to message 0. So if the message 0 had counter 0 on it, and the counter was underneath the encryption, Eve could not necessarily tamper with the counter, but Bob would be able to recognize that message 0 was resent simply by the nonce that was attached to that message. So were there any questions about replays, retries, timestamping, and the adversarial network? Cool. Hopefully the drawing is helpful here. It might be useful, but let me know if there is a different way that I could be drawing such that it was clear.
There was a question in chat. Sorry, Laura. No, there was a question in chat.
Okay. Oh, chats. All right, cool. Easy to miss that. Okay, so is a timestamp any different to using a simple nonce? Yeah, so a simple nonce is not so simple as it turns out, because there are lots of ways that you could generate nonces, and a timestamp is a kind of nonce that you can use. Because if you say the nanoseconds at which a message was timestamped, nanoseconds, this will get to in a couple of minutes. Time moves monotonically forward. That means it doesn't go backwards. So it is a nonce of sorts, but it doesn't have the property of a counter, where a counter is, you can say, if I get messages 1, 2, and 4, I know message 3 got either deleted or blocked or something happened to it, and I could ask for message 3 again. So you couldn't necessarily do that with just a timestamp. And there are cases to use both timestamping as a nonce and some other form of counter-based nonce, such that your nonce is actually the tuple of both a timestamp and a counter. And that's a particularly robust implementation of a nonce that has no randomness at all if we're using a timestamp and a counter. There are other instances where you'd actually want randomness in your nonce. Like, for instance, I don't think we've covered the digital signature algorithm, but in the digital signature algorithm, or ECDSA, we need a nonce that is randomly selected from the field of elements that we're computing over, sort of another, you could think of it as an ephemeral private key. Then we need a different kind of nonce yet, so a sort of randomly selected element from the field. So the question of is a timestamp different to using a simple nonce? Well, if by a counter is what you mean by simple nonce, then yes, because you can tell that messages are missing. If it's a random element that is drawn randomly from some large field, that it's different, yes, because that wouldn't help you in the case that a random element wouldn't necessarily help you know that the sort of message was from 15 minutes ago or 1 second ago. Yeah, I think those are the two examples I would lean on. Is there something that you could achieve with one that you couldn't achieve without the other? I think I talked to that point. Feel free to ask further questions if it wasn't precisely clear. Drawing is really cute. Aw, that's sweet. And okay, cool. And the other thing about the using a clock as a nonce, I suppose, is the importance that we are now talking about the network time protocol, which is a sort of protocol that is a sort of source of potential vulnerability in its own right, because if you have a machine that's entirely eclipsed on the network by malicious actors, they could potentially try to say deceive that entity about what time it actually was. But that's a fairly hard attack, and I don't think I've heard of any practical implementations of it on the internet. It's more practical on distributed system or on decentralized systems where a node on Ethereum, for instance, might only have as many as 5 to 20 nearest neighbors that it talks to, and it might be more possible to eclipse a node in that setting as opposed to the internet. Beep boop. Yeah, all right. I see a couple typing. You can't say how many messages were sent between the two you received with timestamps. Yep. Because if I timestamp at the nanoseconds and I send a message at time 0, and then I send another message at 2 nanoseconds later and another message at 28,000 nanoseconds later and so on, of course you can't say how many messages were sent between. And it could even be the case that if you have some particularly performant hardware, maybe you sent 2 messages at the same timestamp. That's not impossible. It's entirely possible that you could send 2 messages down to the nanoseconds at exactly the same time. So you can't even say that the timestamp method guarantees uniqueness in the system. The only thing that it really gets for you is that you have this sort of time to live and prevent replayability property. Though a nonce of another variety would prevent replayability, the timestamp prevents it allows having this timeout function. And if you implement your system such that you do deny messages that are timestamped down to the nanosecond at the same nanosecond, that is a possible thing to do, and it's not particularly huge in your performance loss. Since like you can certainly use the timestamp as a unique nonce, but you need to enforce that. You can't just assume that the nanoseconds is sufficient to guarantee uniqueness. Block number, something in between. B2. Okay. I guess if we assume the network is asynchronous, you can only assume a nonce. Yep. Yeah, exactly. If the network is asynchronous, you can only assume a nonce, and the network time protocol obtains time to live, but it doesn't necessarily obtain that everyone is honestly participating on the same clock cycles or whatever else. But there are other things related to if you have a timestamp in your nonce system and you receive a timestamp from the future, it means either your clock is wrong or their clock is wrong, and potentially they're maliciously wrong, or potentially you've been maliciously conned. But you can't actually prove which of these cases it is in a sort of trivial way. It's actually quite difficult to say. Someone is wrong. Was someone wronged maliciously? Am I the someone that's wrong, or are they the someone that's wrong? That's a consensus algorithm based question, and consensus algorithms are non-trivial. So see a little bit more typing, but I want to move on to the next section here. So yeah, I think this block of text basically just says everything that I just said. cryptographic protocols and key negotiation in the next section is the main, I think, topic for this lecture is talking about how implementing a cryptographic protocol is highly independent from actually implementing the cryptography. So the key negotiation protocol is the sort of subject of chapter 14. And the sort of thing, excuse me, the sort of takeaway in talking about key negotiation protocols is that they're not trivial to do even after you've nailed down all the cryptography that should go on. There's lots of ways for the protocol for Alice and Bob to choose constants or to select security parameters to go wrong. And again, in the same vein that the adversary can block messages or rearrange messages, we want it to be possible for Alice and Bob to communicate in a way that Alice knows, or such that Bob knows that Alice is honest, and vice versa. But in fact, if we say Bob is a server and Alice wants to talk to Bob the server, Bob isn't going to go out and collect all of the public keys of all of the people that exist in the world. Alice needs to send something to Bob first. And so in the case that Eve sends the first message to Bob, Bob needs to know, or sorry, in the case that Alice sends the first message to Bob, Bob needs to know, A, what Alice's public key is, and B, if it's possible, Alice would like to be authenticated in some way. But on the very first message, it's actually impossible for Alice to do any authentication because Bob knows nothing about Alice. So the first message that Alice might send is her public key. We're going to kind of go over the course of this chapter several sort of takes at how you might construct a key negotiation protocol. But the first thing that Alice might send is her public key. And at this point already things seem sketchy because if Eve says, I see that Alice has tried to send her public key, so let's draw some characters here. We're going to have Alice in purple. I'm going to have Alice in purple. I'm going to have Bob in blue. I say blue and I start writing blue. I'm going to have Eve in pink. So Alice sends her public key to Bob, G to the A, I think was what we said. Oh, I guess it uses X, we'll stick with their convention. So Alice sends G to the X. Eve may already intercept this and say, no, I'm going to intercept here and say, I'm going to send G to the E, which is E's secret key. So there's nothing that Bob can do to know whether he's receiving a unique connection from Alice or from Eve. The main deal for Bob's end of things is all he knows is that he received some connection in this protocol, and he's going to respond back with his key G to the what did we say, Y? Yeah, I don't like their notation, but what? We'll continue doing it. And Eve's going to receive that. Maybe she just goes back and says, I'll send G to the Y back to Alice, so Alice knows. But Eve also knows, and Alice and Eve is now perfectly set up a man-in-the-middle attack. And of course, the only way to prevent this man-in-the-middle attack is basically Alice needs to be able to say, with my public key and my public key only, can I sign a message proving I am who I say I am? And I need Bob to know some way of, this is really my public key. And this is what public key infrastructure accomplishes, is that if there is some central server, which we're going to draw in green, where both of them can go, we're going to call this the PKI server or the CA. Then of course, if Bob can go wander over to the CI server and say, hey, GX is Alice, but since Eve is interrupting here, in fact, if GX, it's G E here, and the server can come back and say, nah. And now Bob has a way of saying, okay, so that's not going to fly. In the same way, if we were to repeat this experiment where Eve was not trying to interrupt Alice, but Eve was trying to interrupt Bob, Alice can go to the public key server and say, "Hey, same thing," and the server can say, "Nah," or "Yeah," if there is no Eve. And so there are, I think, on the order of 600 certificate authorities out in the world that basically fulfill this role. So for the rest of the lecture, we're going to just pretend like the PKI server is just assumed, and we'll say that Alice sending the first message of G to the X is assumed to be valid. Taking a quicko looko at the shadow, you could use the Bitcoin blockchain as a clock. You could, but it'd be a pretty slow clock. Yeah, any clock that ticks forward every 10 minutes and not deterministically so is not a particularly good clock for the kind of messaging applications that you need. You'd have to add other data to the nonce to make sure it was unique. Near uses BLS 381 to generate unique nonces. Many times you'd get transactions at the exact same time block. I'm not sure, so I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the audience. The key derivation function in the thread mentions why don't they recommend a key derivation function instead of a private key? I'm actually not sure what you're asking there, so if you would mind clarifying that and move on to the next question. That's the reason. Okay, so if you have a private key infrastructure, do you need Diffie-Hellman anymore? Yes. The Alice and Bob might choose to use an ephemeral key. So they might sign the message with their long-lasting or long-term key, but instead of using their long-term key, X might be their ephemeral key. So this might be more than just GX in this case. So they might send along a signature using their let's say the signature is going to be denoted theta based on A, where I'm going to say that A is long and X is ephemeral. And that gets forward secrecy or forward security for the protocol, where if either the ephemeral key or the long-term key is obtained, then the adversary doesn't get information about the other. Clarifying ECDSA, why not use a key derivation function instead of public key? So the public private, okay, private key. Yeah, PK is overloaded. Why not use a key derivation function instead of a private key? I'm still not entirely sure what you mean by using a key derivation function, because a key derivation function is a function that Alice can use to obtain a public-private key pair. And she still is going to use her, in this example, the ephemeral private key that she sends to Bob. She would use a key derivation to obtain the ephemeral private key and public key. So I'm not entirely sure what it would mean to use a key derivation function instead of a private key public key pair. And I think the thing that you're saying about ECDSA is a way of leaking less information about or leaking as little information as possible about the private key in the message while still obtaining a perfectly unique source of randomness for the signing process when you're doing ECDSA. Hopefully that was clear. It might not have been. Yeah. So going back to the book, Alice sends her public key. Bob responds with his public key. And this is sort of perfectly naive Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Alice authenticates that she has a key, and Bob authenticates that he has a key. The authentication step is ever so slightly, like one step beyond naive Diffie-Hellman, where Alice says that with her private key or with her public key, or with whatever secret information that she has to authenticate the key, she can authenticate herself to Bob, and Bob can authenticate back. And this is reasonably inefficient in that it's 4 messages instead of 3, as we will see in a moment, that it's certainly possible to do all of this in just 3 communications. It's also not particularly safe if authentication is weak. We generally assume now that authentication is pretty good, and we're not super concerned about authentication leaking bits about the session key, where the session key is K in this case. So we're not super worried about that. But another thing here is that the auth messages, Alice can certainly, or Eve can certainly take a look at the auth messages and maybe try to reuse them in the future, especially if there's no timestamping on that auth. So the, moving on here, the reason that this is reasonably less good than ideal is that A, there's no discussion about what security level Alice and Bob are going to compute over. B, there's more messages than there need to be. C, the protocol does not specifically describe how to obtain forward secrecy using ephemeral keys. And D, the authentication message, as they point out in the second bullet point here, are quite similar, and that Eve might potentially either be able to infer information about the key or reuse the authentication message altogether if nonces are not correctly implemented, but of course they should be. So the next thing that I guess they point out is that anytime a sort of protocol and this sort of like internet stack of things is created, it's basically the end of game for at least the next 5 to 10 years before the protocol is probably going to change at all. There are cases where internet protocols are updated, but they're particularly onerous, and they're probably on the order of tens of millions of dollars of effort every time a protocol on the scale of the internet needs to change. So any protocol that gets chosen needs to be reasonably secure to changes at any particular parameterization, and most significantly the security level of the protocol. Like for instance, the bit security of the public keys is something that Alice and Bob definitely want to be able to control. So the second attempt at key negotiation, I think, is up now, where Alice chooses, as before, Alice chooses a public key with some parameters P, Q, and G. Bob checks that Alice's public key is valid and checks the authentication. And Bob responds with his single response with his public key and responds with an authentication. There's still no negotiation over bit security of what the public parameters should be in this. There's still no suggestion that there's a forward secrecy component in this protocol. And I think what was the other thing? And then I suppose they bring up the authentication problem, but I think the authentication problem is also available in the first protocol that was there. And then I suppose they bring up one final problem, and that is that Alice has only sent one message, so Bob isn't actually sure if Alice will continue to exist. This could have been a delayed message. And this problem, I think, is sort of trivial in that they could solve this fairly easily by just having a timestamp on messages, which I think they do. But it is a serious concern that if there is a way to replay messages and timestamping is not actually implemented, then the message from Alice could be a replay of an old message from Alice. Though I find this to be a reasonably trivial objection. So a third attempt, I think, is the one where they kind of get serious here. So the third attempt is where they're going to choose a minimum security parameter. Alice chooses a minimum size for the security parameter P, and now they're actually doing key negotiation, because the negotiation part is that Alice says that I want there to be at least this level of security, and Bob needs to agree to some level of security. So Alice sends some minimum security size, and Bob is forced to respond to the security parameter that Alice sends. Alice then knows that they can agree on some security parameter. And further, when let's see, so oh no, they these guys. Okay, uh, yeah. So they switched up their notification, or they switched up their notation from G to the X was Alice's private key public key pair to GX is now Bob's private key public key pair. So bearing with that, Alice in her first message says, "I want this level of security, and I'm not even going to send my private key or my public key." She probably also wants to send her private key for the record. But she's also going to use a unique nonce now, and the nonce might be the combination of a timestamp and some counter, as we discussed from the previous section. Bob knows that if he's receiving some timestamp and counter, he at least has some sense that he's not missing messages from Alice, and that Alice's messages are arriving in some conceivably correct order. Bob can reply with his public key and choose public key or can choose curve parameters such that they obey Alice's requests. Alice can check the curve parameters that Bob responds with and respond with her own public key. And of course, they can authenticate in the latter two messages there. We can use public key infrastructure in composition with this. They don't actually mention it at all, I think, in this section. But the final protocol that they describe is one that I think I assigned a homework exercise on for this week. And the question is to sort of go through all of the checks described in this protocol and gain some understanding of why each of those checks are important. So that's the main sort of focus of, I think, this week's exercises, is that the way that we design these protocols such that even if the cryptography is secure, how do we design the protocols such that they are robust to changes over time and robust to authentication and man-in-the-middle attacks and timestamping and nonces. This is sort of the central problem of cryptography outside of the mathematical algorithm is still reasonably incomplete in that there are lots of things that an adversary could necessarily do just from a network protocols perspective. And so cryptography is never entirely in isolation from the practice of security engineering. There's always a sort of interplay between the content of the cryptography and the content of the protocol, which is a fairly large topic in itself. But the last thing to really nail here is forward secrecy. And so the premise of forward secrecy is that we always want Alice and Bob to be using ephemeral keys when they establish session keys, as opposed to the long-term private key or public key pair. And the reason for that, as I think I mentioned before, is that with an ephemeral key, if Alice loses her ephemeral key to an adversary, or her private key to an adversary, that should not leak any further information about past communications that Alice has made. So if Alice sends a message on January 30th, messages sent on January 29th should still be secure. And this means that Alice can respond to security problems and react to them by creating a new key pair and re-registering however she would like to do that in further protocols. So this is called forward secrecy. It's been a fairly big deal in TLS 1.3, where forward secrecy used to not be required in TLS 1.2. TLS 1.3, which I think was standardized in 2018, required forward secrecy for all future sessions using TLS 1.3. And so this is like one of the examples of how a downgrade attack, where Alice asks to use TLS 1.3 and Bob only knows about TLS 1.2. Alice might be able to say, I will not connect to anyone who's not using TLS 1.3 or HTTPS or whatever. So if Bob only knows about HTTP TLS 1.2, then Alice is potentially not obtaining forward secrecy, even though there is an option to obtain forward secrecy using TLS 1.2. So this is sort of the premise here of using ephemeral keys means that an adversary has less capacity to break the security of a protocol based on the use of this sort of ephemeral knowledge. And it also means that Alice is trusting Bob in some degree less because she knows that Bob could not possibly leak information about her other sessions, including her public key, even though her public key is perfectly fine to share. Um, so the last thing to quickly cover here is we kind of skimmed over nonce usage for replay attacks. Chapter 16 gives a high-level overview about using Uncloak for nonce generation, and kind of goes into maybe some of the stuff that I said here. So for a good review on using clocks and doing nonce generation, chapter 16 is a good read. So this week's exercises are mostly focused around talking about designing protocols that sort of are the envelope around cryptography. And they're not very implementation oriented, since the sort of content in this section is not particularly implementation oriented, but I hope you'll enjoy them and give them a shot. So with that, I think we'll answer any questions before wrapping up.
I have a question regarding kind of the nonce generation, or like nonce versus like ordering. It kind of brings in the secure channel as well as like this key negotiation part. And we've been talking about nonces as like this as like as a way of making sure that you can't do replay attacks. But then we also have this question of like message ordering. So there's a way that you can also combine nonce with message ordering, but I'm wondering what's like the standard? Do you usually like separate the message ordering from the nonce generation? Do you try to combine them? That's where I'm a bit lost.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes you're going to look at sort of the capacity to prove that a message is unique, and the capacity to forge the timestamp. So if the nonce lies, if they say counter nonce lies underneath encryption and the timestamp lies above encryption, then Alice um, has left timestamp to be manipulated by the adversary. Um, so it makes sense to say put both of these things underneath the encryption layer, where I'm using this line as the things that Alice has sent that Bob or that Eve can manipulate or see. So if both of these lie in the encryption box, Bob can't do any immediate checks on the validity of this without decrypting it. Um, but if they lie outside, then Eve can manipulate it, of course. So I think the question is, like, when we're talking about nonce generation, usually only one of these things is actually important for the cryptographic protocol itself. Like, for instance, I think in AES-CBC, we use a nonce for initializing the protocol. So maybe the counter nonce is actually too predictable. And in fact, we need a third kind of nonce for some source of randomness. Um, so the different use cases for all of these, whether it's a sort of source of randomness for your nonce, a counter to say the messages were delivered in order, or a timestamp, all of these sort of have their place, and not every protocol necessarily needs all of these. So if there wasn't actually a need for a randomness source, it's very easy to just say I wouldn't probably need a nonce for randomness. If your network is entirely secure, you might not even need a timer, just to sort of message counter, just say make sure that the messages were delivered in order, because say the delivery, the transit protocol was not deterministic. But I think in general we think about nonces as being at least one of these three things, and possibly others too. But these are the three main ones as far as I know. Was that helpful?
Yeah, that was helpful. I think even part of that though, it's this idea of a secure channel. At least the definition of it is that Bob can always recover some subsequence of message ordering. And I guess that's I think you've kind of answered that, which is that like you have these two things kind of lie below the encryption box. So even like authentication saying like this is the ordering of messages that Alice is sending and authenticates that message or that ordering sequence so that Bob can always recover that at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. does cryptography in storage much simpler? So I mean, I guess that's opposed to cryptography over the network. Um, Much simpler is kind of hard to model because if it's cryptography and storage, oftentimes the adversary model for a network adversary is one that can listen, permute, block, or manipulate. Um, but the in storage model might be more likely to consider an adversary that can analyze the actual hardware. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that we try not to put secret keys in long-term hard disk storage, and because the one of the adversary models for secret information in long-term storage is that even if that memory gets zeroed out, it turns out that memory has, in some ways, memory of what was on it even before it got zeroed out, if we're talking about long-term hard disk storage. So an adversary might be able to remind the hardware what secret information was on it before with a little bit of twiddling. So the model for how does cryptography and storage change? Well, it means that we usually consider what happens if an adversary gets their hands on the hardware, and hardware is you can do quite a bit of analysis on it, even if you can't sort of say give me private key. You can do power based analysis, so if there's any change in how the algorithm operation executes based on the secret information, then maybe there's changes in how power distributes across the processor. There are known forms of attacks on that. For a particularly freaky kind of attack that's sort of been around for a while, called Van Eck freaking, pun intended. It's a freaky attack because all an adversary needs to do is have a frequency monitor, sort of like power. Basically, if the adversary can put a sensor near your laptop and still eke out information about how the laptop is using power, and that sometimes is sufficient to obtain information about your private key in memory, even though the adversary never touched your laptop but only had a power monitor near it. So I'll put that in the chat. So the in storage bit is to say, is it simpler? Maybe, kind of, sometimes. Different is probably the better word, because we tend to think the adversary might be interested or able to do other things than they would be able to do than a remote adversary. I think password, I forget what PAKE stands for, but there are lots of sort of research into designing secure password storage algorithms. So that would be a reason to look into that. Why can't Alice establish an informal key by generating one on her side, encrypting it with Bob's public key without using DH? She might not have Bob's public key yet. So she has to get Bob's public key from somewhere, and she might just not have it. Like this was the vision for PGP or GPG, was that by a distributed network of people who exchange private keys between trusted parties and what was called the web of trust, everyone would eventually just obtain one another's private key, public key, or everyone would obtain everyone else's public key, but that didn't really pan out. So Alice needs Bob's public key in the first place, and probably doesn't have it. Especially if Bob's using his ephemeral key as opposed to his long-term public key for session keys. I think if Eve ever gets the long-term key, she can decrypt every session key false. That is not true. And this is why we describe this as forward secrecy. If Eve obtains the long-term key, she can obtain every future session, but not every past session. Because if she has the long-term public key, then she can obtain future created session keys, but not old ones. So if Alice was to reshuffle her long-term public or her long-term private key, then she would then be secure again, assuming Eve couldn't get it again. Yeah.
I,
Go ahead.
I'll just clarify a bit where that was. I think 364 megahertz was referencing if they had the PKI and they could always have their private public key, or they could see each other's public keys. Why wouldn't they just use that key exchange to then create new session keys? And the answer is, oh, I think the answer is because all session keys can then be decrypted if they found the long-term private key. Whereas if we use the forward secrecy, that doesn't apply,
Yeah, yeah,
like you
exactly.
mentioned. Okay.
Okay, yeah, precisely. Yeah, cool. So peeking ahead to next session, there is the next session's notes are up. We're going to be dipping out into a mathematical introduction to cryptography. We're going to be taking a look at some of the sections in the first chapter. There are some notes about how to read a mathematical textbook, specifically how to absorb definitions, what to look for in sort of theorems versus proofs, and sort of how to approach the topic. Most of the section for next week is basically review. So or some of the section is review, but I think it's all at a sort of mathematically more rigorous level than you've so far been exposed to. So it's a sort of opportunity to take a closer look at how the mathematical machinery works underneath asymmetric key cryptography. And since asymmetric key cryptography is more and more just becoming the cryptography, this is more of a sort of like authentic look into what I think cryptography engineers and cryptographers are often doing when they're doing cryptography. Is they're working both with the implementation details of an algorithm, but also its mathematical sort of why does it work. So yeah, good luck, and looking forward to seeing you next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you all next week.
Bye.
Thank you.